And so if you do ask, there's a chance they come on your podcast. There's also a chance they don't come on your podcast. But if you don't ask, there's no chance they come on your podcast. So I highly encourage everyone just to shoot your shot. And even if they do say no, nobody ever says no forever. They're just saying no for right now. So you can build up your podcast, get that social proof, ask them again in 6 months, and then they'll come on your show then.
Welcome to the Soundboard with Tofe podcast. To the industry leaders and forward-thinking companies, this is your resource to become a better podcaster. You'll be taken on a journey to learn tips and tricks around podcast strategy, editing, and curation. And here's your host, Tofe Evans.
Hey guys, Tofe here, your host of the Soundboard with Tofe podcast. This is your resource to become a better podcaster if you're a thought leader, subject matter expert, or a forward-thinking company. In this episode, I interview Jacob Kelly. Jacob is the host of My Social Life podcast, where he's on a mission to inspire the next wave of content creators and show them that their dreams are not only attainable, but realistic. I met Jacob through a mutual connection of ours. His name is Swish Goswami. He's the founder of Surf, which is a browser extension that has, I believe, more than or close to 100,000 users in the space of 8 to 9 months, which is very impressive. Jacob is the head of influencer marketing for them. And we got to chat a while back before the podcast, and really cool conversation that we had. And I thought, why not get him on the podcast? And we go into why he interviews people that do really well on TikTok and YouTube, in those two platforms in particular. We talk about his process in booking guests. I know that can be quite valuable for those who are looking to book bigger guests and having a framework around that. So he goes through his process, which you can obviously use so that you can apply to your approach. We talk about what keeps him going after having 395 episodes, because it is a long haul and sometimes it can feel like this chaotic mess that we somehow managed to make happen. But he talks about what keeps him going, because pod fade is a real thing. And we also talk about his curation process when he turns his episodes into micro content for TikTok and YouTube Shorts. Now, before we go into the episode, please follow or subscribe if you haven't done so already. That's how you can support me. And enjoy the episode with Jacob Kelly. So welcome, Jacob. Thank you for tuning into the Soundboard with Tofe podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me, man. I'm excited to be here.
I appreciate it, man. And the reason why I wanted to have you on, I know we've spoken before in a different conversation, and I found it really interesting with what your podcast is about, right? You are the host of My Social Life. One thing I have noticed is a lot of your guests are YouTubers and TikTokers. Why have you chosen those two platforms in particular?
I think in the terms of the social landscape right now, if you're trying to build a brand on social media, like those are probably the two main ones. Like there's the conversation happening now, is Instagram dying, this and that. But TikTok, there's just so much traction, virality there right now that you can build a following very quickly. And over time that can become a brand. And then YouTube is, I think, a place where you can really cement your brand as something solid. You can't build a loyal YouTube fan base if it's not a true, like if it's not a good, solid group of people that follow you. Like TikTok, you can go viral on one video and get 100,000 followers overnight. YouTube, you kind of can now with YouTube Shorts, but if you're doing long form YouTube content, to get to 100,000 subscribers takes some serious work and a serious connection with that audience. And so I think those are two of the pillar platforms if you're trying to build a brand online in 2022. I think LinkedIn, you can do that as well. I know there's some good virality and you can get a lot of traction on LinkedIn. But personally, I don't use LinkedIn that much. I use TikTok and YouTube probably the most. And so it just made the most sense for my podcast to kind of hone in on those two things. I think early on in the show, I got a little bit too broad and I was interviewing a little bit of everyone from everywhere. But I really tried to focus up the podcast and focusing it up. That means I'm trying to have mainly guests from TikTok and YouTube on.
Tell me this, and you would have a much better understanding than I would. Why is it that you can get 100,000 views on a TikTok video? Is it to do with the algorithm? Is it because it's an entirely different following that sees the videos?
It's to do with the algorithm and how the content is delivered. I think when we think about Instagram, you're for the most part, unless you're on the explore page, but you're more often than not consuming content in your following feed. I know Instagram's changing that now and they're trying to do things kind of like what TikTok's doing. It's not working as well in my opinion. But with TikTok, one, just the algorithm is very good at figuring out who should be watching your video based off of what other videos they've watched. So the algorithm is very good at selecting who should view that content. And two, the consumption habits of users on TikTok is different, where they're consuming content that is just served to them versus YouTube, you have to make the decision to watch content, and versus Instagram, where you're only going through people you follow. TikTok, it's being served to you and people that you don't follow. More people consume through the For You page, which is like the explore page. So TikTok is selecting the content that you can see, and TikTok is very good at matching it to people that want to watch it. So because of the algorithm, because of how it's delivered, that's why TikTok is more powerful. And that's why there's a lot of virality on the platform right now.
Yeah, there's so much talk about TikTok. There's the funds that they're bringing out, and it's like this battle of vertical video that I'm noticing. When I had a look at your podcast and your content that you put around it, you interview some really interesting guests. I think JT Barnett, he's killing it in the TikTok game. And there's a bunch of other people. What do you exactly look for when you're interviewing these guests? Like, what makes you want to interview these people?
I think obviously like you need to have somewhat of a following on YouTube or TikTok. Like it's tough because the premise of the show I positioned it is teaching you how to grow in social media by talking to people who have actually done it. So if you're listening to a podcast with 4,000 followers on TikTok and the guest has 8,000, like there's only so much we're gonna be able to glean from that. Like we're not gonna be able to talk about how to get to that next level as a creator if that person hasn't gotten there themselves. Like maybe they've managed an account that's gotten there, and that's a different kind of conversation about like, should I have this person or not? But for the most part, I look to see, do they have a following? And do I think the content they're creating is interesting? And if those two things kind of line up, then I'll have them on the show. Like I'm not too picky, but I try to keep mainly people who have built an established following on one of these platforms and also have an engaged community. Like I've had some people DM me asking to come on the show, and like right now I'm not taking any inbounds. That makes my life a lot easier. Like I'm just not taking inbounds at all as a rule right now, just so that, because I'm a little bit too busy to be, I'm doing my own outreach. To have other people coming inbound is just too much right now. But like I've looked at people to potentially come on the show that have like 3 million followers, but they only have 4,000 or 5,000 views per video. So like there's clearly a disconnect into like how they grew their audience and what they're posting now. And so I try to have people who have grown a decent following on social media, but are also have some considerable traction on the platform still as well.
That's interesting, right? It comes down to what I'm hearing: social proof and credibility. The top podcasters around the world, some of them will go on rotation, right? On each other's podcast because they've got the following. And from a social perception, that can help them enhance their brand. And then there was something else that you spoke about, where there are people out there that can, I don't know how, because I've never really looked into it and I'm not really interested too, but people who can purchase followers. And then when you look at their views, and this is on I'm guessing just Instagram, it doesn't line up. Like you said, there's a bit of a disconnect.
I'm assuming you could buy followers on TikTok or views on YouTube or anything like that. I don't think it's exclusive to Instagram. But with TikTok, I don't think that's usually when I see an account with a lot of followers and not as many views, it's not because they bought their followers in most cases. And on TikTok, they probably went viral for something completely unrelated to the content that they post. So they got a lot of followers because of this video that went viral. But if you went viral because you posted a funny video of your cat, but you're a carpenter on TikTok, when you start posting your carpentry videos, people aren't going to engage with it because they followed you because they liked your funny cat video you posted that one time. And so people will build audiences like that off viral content that has nothing to do with their regular content. And so when they start posting the regular content, it doesn't do what you think it should for the amount of followers that they have.
Right. There's a personal branding conflict there. That's what I'm hearing. Like I deal with this on a basis because my stuff is around podcasting. However, I've had a background in endurance sports and in mental health. So there are times where I want to talk about the mental health stuff because I'm also passionate about that, but I'm also passionate about podcasting. But then I'm thinking, is this going to create a conflict? And Gary Vaynerchuk was on Logan Paul's podcast the other day, and he was talking about this exactly, where people think he's the gratitude guy, and that people thought he's the garage sale guy when he's really, I'm just a business guy, if anything. Like I just love building businesses. And oh man, I found that so interesting. Yeah. One thing I did notice your with your podcast is you've had about 395 to 400 episodes. I found that so interesting. Like, what keeps you going?
That's a very good question. I think part of it is one, I just love doing it. So I enjoy sitting down and interviewing people. I also think it's just the momentum of having done that many episodes. So I have posted, I think, a new episode every single week since September of 2018. I started the show in end of July 2018. I moved between episodes 3 and 4. And so I missed the upload between episode 3 and 4. But since then, I have been consistent and posted a new episode since September of 2018. So I think that consistency of not having missed a week for almost 4 years now and not wanting to ruin that streak has kept me going. I also love doing it. It's not like the only reason I'm doing it is for the consistency, but that definitely helps. That momentum that I've built up over the last 400 or so episodes, which is I do an interview week and a solo episode that I talk about my interview every week. But that's, like I said, almost 4 years straight with uploading every week and not missing. And I don't want to ruin that streak.
I love that, man, because there's a lot of accountability there, right? And for me, I hear that it removes the notion of I'm doing this to get so many downloads. And it's the same thing I find in social media. Like if I don't post and I don't hit that viral content, like what's the point of posting? And it's the same thing. It's literally showing up every day because there is a lesson in that in itself. And something about that with showing up with posting, it's the content you put out, right? So I know you're big on curation. Like a lot of the content I've seen that you've put up is essentially these small videos that go out into, say, YouTube Shorts, or it's on TikTok, mainly TikTok. That's where I've usually seen your stuff. Tell me about that process, because it's a very time-consuming process, getting a full episode and going through it and going, this is the most compelling part, or this is the thing that's going to get the most amount of value. How do I bring it down to, say, 20, 30 seconds? Because we live in a world where attention is such a rare commodity and it's intangible. Can't really touch attention, but it can turn into something that's tangible. Tell me about that process, Jacob, when you're going, all right, this is good. I'm going to turn this into content, because who knows if it's going to hit, who knows if it isn't.
I think for me, what I do is once I finish editing the video, I go back and I skip through the podcast and I just listen to the question I asked. And usually how I'll base a clip is kind of on feel, really. Like if I'm listening to a question that I asked and I remember they said this really good response to that question, and then I'll kind of pull that as a moment. So it's like, what stands with me after I've had a minute to step away from the podcast, after I've edited the full video? Like what still resonates with me now a day later? What do I still remember just off the top of my head? And if I remember, there's clearly something sticky about that resonated. So I'll pull that as a clip. So I try to do as quickly as possible because I am a one-man operation. So I'm doing all of everything from finding guests to publishing all on my own. So I try to do it as fast as possible. So I just skim through, listen to my question I usually double speed the audio so it goes quicker as well. Listen to my question. If I go, I think there's a good answer here, I'll just listen to their answer. I find it. Once I usually have 2 to 3 good clips, I'll call it, because I can't comb through the whole podcast looking for every individual good moment. I usually just pull usually 2, sometimes 3, 4 if I can't decide between a couple. But that's usually my process for finding those clips.
Right. And you just said then that you're a one-man operation. How do you structure your days? Like you've got to find the guests, and you keep, because you've got 400 episodes and you've had this consistent hot streak, I'm sure there's a process in place. There's a method to the madness.
Sort of. It feels a lot more like madness sometimes, where I just make it work however I got to make it work. But usually I kind of try to like block out time, and I'll email a bunch of guests at once. And I have a Notion page, which has every guest I've reached out to. And then I'd send 2 follow-ups before I stop bugging people. So whenever I send someone an email, I add them from like I have a list of people who I think would be interesting. And then once I email them, I drag them to the first email. And then if they don't answer, I send a follow-up, a second email, a third email. And then I also have have they responded? Have they confirmed a recording? Did they respond? But then I lost contact. Then have I followed up again? Like there's another follow-up section section, and there's I lost contact section and a declined section. And so that's probably the closest thing to the method is I just have a Notion page that tracks everybody I've reached out to, everyone I think is interesting that I should reach out to, where we're at in the conversation. So that's probably the closest thing I have to a method, is this Notion page that I've built that just kind of tracks all the communication I have with all of the guests. So that's how I do it. And usually for figuring out who I want to reach out to, sometimes it's just scrolling on TikTok, and when a video compels me, I click on the profile. How many followers do they have? Was it a one-off video that went viral? How do they do? Is there some consistency here? Do they post the same type of content? And on YouTube, I'll just go around and I'll see interesting thumbnails. I click on the thumbnail. If they got a decent following and the video's good and they have multiple videos that have done well, like I'll just add them to this list, and I just keep adding to this list. And when I need new guests, I'll set some time aside. I'll send out, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 emails, depending on the day, and how many guests I have coming up and things like that. That's kind of the method. But again, as I'm talking here, and it does feel a little bit more like madness than a method, but it's worked for me.
From all that, what's the best opportunity that's come from having your own podcast?
There's one I can't talk about at the moment. That the best opportunity I've gotten from the podcast, I hate to be that guy, but like I can't talk about it yet because it's not public information yet. That's what I was going to tell you right before we jumped on, but I'll tell you after. But I can't tell everybody listening right now until this thing is public, unfortunately. But you could trace a lot of the good things that are going on in my life right now back to my podcast. You know, like my current job, which I'm influencer marketing manager for Surf. Like really, if you trace a lot of this stuff back, it's like, it's through relationships I had that kind of like were off the podcast, but then I deepened relationships because I had somebody on the podcast that helped me get a job at Surf. And like, so I think a lot of the good things that are going on in my life right now are a direct result of the podcast. A lot of the relationships I've made, like you mentioned, JT Barnett, like he's someone I talk to every once in a while. Tom Boyd, someone I talk to on not a regular, but like a semi-regular basis. Like I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of really smart people and create some relationships and connections that never would have happened had I not had the show. So I think the biggest opportunity has just been the opportunity to meet people I wouldn't have normally had. Like there's no direct, like when I had my own marketing agency, it's not like every client came in from the podcast or anything like that. Like you could trace a solid amount of why I have my job right now to the fact I had the podcast, but it's not the entire reason. But like just the opportunity to meet these people and establish these connections, I definitely think has been one of the biggest benefits of my show for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm really intrigued to hear about this opportunity afterwards. And obviously I won't be airing any of it. I would like to talk more about Surf. So you just touched on it, and I'd say Swish, who is the founder of Surf, which used to be, I believe, TrueFan, is the one that connected us in the first place. And
correct. Which is the hat I've got on now.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And it's interesting how this browse extension, hopefully it turns into what Honey's done. You mentioned that you manage the influencer marketing. And if I were to make some sort of correlation with podcasting, it's the ability to build the relationships and having those high profile guests where you can book them for your podcast. That's the correlation that I hear. For anyone that is listening and going, how do I book guests? Like, how do I book those high profile guests? Like you touched on part of it, like with your process with having a Notion page, and a lot of it does come to the follow up, and maybe it helps having some credibility that you can go, look, I can give you some sort of exposure. But what are the practical tips that you can give to people that are struggling to understand how to book guests?
First thing on the Surf front, I'll just touch on that super quickly. I think the benefit that kind of the connection point between podcasting and Surf, I mean, one, Surf sponsors the show, so that's a direct connection. But also is that it helps me see both perspectives. Like when I'm talking to an influencer for my job, I'm talking to them as a brand, but I also understand their perspective because I'm also the creator and I talk to creators every single week. So it allows me to kind of have a 360 view as someone working in influencer marketing where I understand both sides. And I haven't had too many creators we've worked with actually come on the show. I think it's only been 2, and it's more until like once we've worked with them and we had a good working experience is to deepen that relationship. I invite them on the podcast, but I would never reach out to someone who's like, oh, they'd be a great guest for the show. Let me see if I can leverage TrueFan or Surf to get them to work with them and then get them on the podcast. It's only been once we've had a positive experience working together, I want to deepen that relationship. And so I invite them on the podcast after as a kind of way to keep the conversation going with them between Surf and them when we have no existing campaign to work with them on. But for the most part, it's just been the biggest benefit is being able to see 360. But you asked me about the best ways to kind of get in front of or to send that outreach. And I think the biggest thing that I've been able to do is I use social proof. Like that's been the biggest kicker. It's like, that's the benefit I have right now being in the position that I am. Like I have some numbers and some guests I can include in that email that would make someone more compelled to come on the podcast. You know, like in my outreach email, I think I'll break down my outreach email. Maybe that'll be the easiest way to kind of to do this. But so my first line is a compliment to that person. You know, I watched you in this video and I really like this, or this video you put out was hilarious. It really made me laugh. Or I've said like, my girlfriend and I really like your TikToks. We'll watch them together. Or like, but like, you don't want to lie, but you send that email, you compliment the guest, then it's directly into who I am, what the show is. I want you on. Like, you got to be pretty direct. Like you don't want to meander here. So I'll say like, so it's the compliment, then direct, this is the show, I want you on the show. Here's some information about the show. So for me, it's like over 900,000 streams all time, top 3% podcasts in the world. Past guests include, and then I'll put some big name guests on there that I've had. So usually it's like Sean Does Magic, who's over 20 million followers on TikTok. I also look to see who's that person I want to have on know. And then I'll look and see, is there anybody that they know that I've had on the show? And so that just creates a little bit of comfort when they see it's like a couple of their friends have come on the podcast. Oh, like my buddy, this and this have been on the show. Like it must be a fine show then. And things like that. So then I highlight some guests and then I just say, this is my longer version. I have two versions, but I usually use the long one. And then I'll quickly highlight 3 things I want to cover in the interview. And then if this works, here's a booking link, and then that's it. So it is a little bit long, but it's very to the point with everything that's in there. I have a bit of a shorter one that doesn't have what we're going to talk about and not all of the guests and stuff. But that's usually what my outreach looks like. It's that long email. And I try to just hit all the relevant points as concise as I possibly can, use some bullet lists, and then I reach out. But again, I have the benefit of being someone in a position where I've had some guests and I have some social proof now and I have some views and things like that. But to the person listening to this who doesn't have that, I would say don't not reach out because you don't have those things. So many people talk themselves out of reaching out to somebody, but the thing is you never know who you're going to say who's going to say yes to you. You know, like in the beginning, I had some people who said yes that I was surprised just because I reached out, because I asked. And so if you never ask, they're never going to come on your podcast. But if you ask and they say no, they're still not coming on your podcast. So the outcome is the same. The only possible change in outcome is them actually coming on your podcast. And so if you do ask, there's a chance they come on your podcast. There's also a chance they don't come on your podcast. But if you don't ask, there's no chance they come on your podcast. So I highly encourage everyone just to shoot your shot. And even if they do say no, nobody ever says no forever. They're just saying no for right now. So you can build up your podcast, get that social proof, ask them again in 6 months, and then they'll come on your show then.
It's not a no, it's a not yet. That's what I hear. There's one thing you said that I think is so important with that approach is how personal that is. That opening line with a compliment shows that you did your due diligence, shows that the person said, I took the time to do some research on you, because it doesn't come across as generic. Like yes, you can have a standardized approach, which you do have, but the literal execution in the approach, the operations of it is quite personable. And I think that makes it human by doing that. And I love that, because otherwise it wouldn't have the same quality or caliber of, I guess, conversation, because people might be thinking it's a numbers game and just trying to get that up. And I understand, because you want to kind of get the momentum going, but there's also the way you do anything is the way you do everything. So I think that is so important by doing that research. And over time it creates confidence. Like, based on confidence, I'm curious to know if you can give like a quick snapshot. What was it like doing the first few episodes to doing almost hitting 400 now?
The first few episodes were interesting. I think that everything was still so new to me. And my first guest was a good friend of mine who's also my 100th guest. He's been around the show from the beginning. So it's a good friend of mine. But then I can remember my second episode ever was someone I had never met before. I just DM'd them on Instagram cold and they said they'd come on the podcast. And like, that was crazy to me that this guy who was an ultra marathoner, like a world-class ultra marathoner that happened to live in my city, drove all the way out to the suburbs where I lived at the time to my apartment to come to my house to do this podcast. And so like, I think there was a level of like, I don't know if naivety is the right word, but like almost giddiness with the podcast in the beginning. And it's not that I'm not giddy now, but it was all new and exciting at the time versus now it's like, I get people on the podcast and I'm very even keel about it because I never want someone to think I'm a fan on the podcast. You know what I mean? I never want it to come across like that. And I want them to feel comfortable. But like I can remember my third guest when he said yes to come on my podcast, a friend of mine now, but at the time, like I was just this guy with this clothing company I thought was really cool. And he happened to say yes to come on the podcast and he was going to come to my apartment and record. And I remember like freaking out that this guy said yes. Like this guy, I think had like 14,000 followers at the time. And now somebody with like 20 million followers will come on the podcast and I'll be like, oh, nice. Versus like when the guy back in the day with 14,000 followers said yes, I was like celebrating because I didn't realize what was possible. I think that's one thing I've realized over time is I understand what's possible now. And like in the beginning, someone with 1 million followers coming on my podcast, I was like, that's not possible. I have to be bigger. I have to do all these things. But I think now over time, I just realize what's possible. I don't know if I'm fully answering your question. I feel like as I'm talking here, I'm overthinking that I'm not answering it correctly. But I think the biggest thing that from those first couple episodes is just how new and exciting everything was for me. And it's important to hold on to that feeling as long as you possibly can. And I have in a sense, but of course, naturally over time, like 400 episodes in, like you said, like naturally, I'm not going to feel the exact same as when I just finished recording my first episode, but try to hold on to some essence of that feeling the entire time.
Well, the big lesson that I got from all that, from what I heard is with approaching it as a fan, what can tend to happen, what I've done for myself is I'll put that person on a pedestal in my mind, right? And as opposed to coming from it like a human being, like just another regular person. And it's like meeting a CEO of a company and thinking they're bigger than who I am as a person. They're worth more because of their status, what they've done in their lives, when really they're just a human being. They've just lived a totally different life. And I'm going to totally butcher it, but I remember seeing something about Michael Jordan, and he is like he's the GOAT, right? Like he's done everything in basketball that everyone's trying to achieve. He's totally changed the entire culture of the NBA and sports in general and clothing, fashion, everything he touches turns to gold. He's essentially Midas. And he was talking about how a lot of people approach him as fans and he's not going to continue that relationship as opposed to someone that approaches him as a friend. So that's just something that I took from that, because he would get it more than anyone where someone puts him on a pedestal, then he's not going to be treated. Because how many times celebrities or anyone that is recognized that has a big, has quite the social proof is like, it's crazy, man. I can't even eat dinner by myself, or I'm out in public and all the person wants is just a photo of me so they can put on their social media, as opposed to someone that just says hello. And that's what I heard from approaching and speaking with these guests. They're just people at the end of the day. They've just lived totally different lives. And I think if we look at that and extract the learnings and the lessons from that, that becomes valuable and it makes it easier to build the relationship. It does become hard though, because when you have someone that you idolize or that I idolize and go, damn, I really want to have that conversation with them. How do I make it as if I'm not fangirling them? I just want to have the conversation with them. So that's my 2 cents on what I heard from that. But as we start to wrap things up, Jacob, I just want to say I appreciate your time, man. I love what you're doing. I'm a big fan of surf, and I'm waiting for it to come to Australia because the browser extension only does, I believe, America and Canada. But from a podcasting standpoint, from the value you're giving with interviewing essentially these high profile TikTokers and YouTubers, it ends up becoming an easier blueprint for people to understand, so that they can maybe they can learn from people that have that have done it, so that hopefully they can figure out some of the lessons quicker. So I just want to acknowledge you and say thank you for coming on the show. The last question I have for you is, what's the number one piece of advice you could give to an inspiring podcaster?
Well, first off, man, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate that. And I want to compliment you on what you do really well with this is whenever I feel like I give these long meandering answers where I try to figure out kind of what I want to say as I'm saying it. And you do a very good job of listening to me kind of just meander through my own brain here and then distilling it down into a very eloquent lesson from that. You're very good at that, where I'll give it like what you just did there, where you're talking about how it's about people are people at the end of the day. Like I was like a 3-minute answer and you just kind of like, you found the point in that, whatever I was trying to say, and you distilled it really well. So I just want to compliment you that you're very good at that. And now you're going to have to the advice. I remember the last question here. And I think the biggest advice obviously is just start. I think there's a few like just start has been like my classic advice for like the last 2 years is like, just get going. I thought about starting my podcast for like 6 months before I actually started it. And when I finally did start it, I still wasn't ready. I know it still took me 24 hours to edit my first episode, but what I will say is like, yes, just start, but have a little bit of direction. You know, I used to just kind of be like, just start, get out there, throw it out there and see what happens and just take action. Yes. But also if you can aim just slightly before you take action, you can get to much better results. You know, I was listening to something yesterday. I don't know if it was Tony Robbins or it was some self-help person was saying that basically like when you're golfing, if you're off by just like 3 degrees in the beginning, the final outcome of where that ball ends up can be dramatically different. Like if you instead of hitting it straight, if you hit 3 degrees to the right, it's going to slice and it's going to go a lot further just because you didn't properly aim right at the beginning. That micro difference in the beginning over time, and it had you way in the rough. You weren't on the fairway. So I think, yes, take action and start, but just take a minute, take a breath, and think about where you want this to go and how is what you're doing the best servicing that end goal. Just take a little bit of time to figure out where you're going and aim a little bit before you shoot.
Oh, I love that. That's really good advice because the direction is I'd say just as important because it's about taking a step back and looking long term as opposed to being myopic and then execute. And then there is so much in it, that in itself. But dude, beautiful advice. Thank you for coming onto the show. Appreciate you.
You too, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening, and for more information about Soundboard services, please check out the show notes. Lastly, Soundboard acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, paying respects to elders past, present and emerging.